Hello, my name is Sue Harvey. I'm a director at Campbell Tickell, and I'm part of the team that works with our local authority and housing association clients to support them in the new regulation of the consumer standards. What I'd like to do today is just take you through some of the analysis we've done on the grades that our regulator, the Regulator of Social Housing, has issued since the start of this new regime. And just a caveat to start with, the slides that I'm about to share include data up to the end of July of this year, and that covers 119 consumer grades issued. So that's an assessment by the regulator of a social housing landlord's performance against the consumer standards. A C grade is published at the end of every inspection or review that the regulator undertakes, and those so-called C grades range from C1 at the top to C4 at the bottom. Housing associations are used to having G for governance and V for viability grades. So the C grade is new for them, and for local authority landlords, this is the first time they will have been proactively regulated against the consumer standards. We have seen 119 C grades published since the beginning, since April 2024, when this new regime began. We estimate there to be about 360 social housing landlords that will be given a public C grade by the end of the programme, this current programme, and that's all social housing landlords with more than 1,000 homes. So we think we're about a third of the way through the programme to give each of those landlords a C grade, and then the regulator will start again so that it will work through every social housing landlord with more than 1,000 homes over a 4-year period. 119 is certainly a decent sample, but you'll see in the slides that follow that we're going to cut that data by subcategories, and on occasions we land up with a small number, and we have to hesitate when we draw conclusions from small numbers, and you'll see there's a star against some of the numbers in the slides that follow. And another reason for some caution is we don't know, but there may be some oversampling or underrepresentation of particular categories in the third of the programme that has resulted in public grades to date. So for a couple of reasons, we need to be a little bit wary about drawing conclusions from the data, but we still feel it's useful to take a look at those results and see what we can learn from them. So our first slide is 2 pie charts, and I'm going to start with the one on the right. This demonstrates the engagement process for each of those 119 public gradings. And you can see that the vast majority, over 80%, were derived through the programme of regulatory inspections. And that's when the regulator turns up, reads a lot of documents, observes some meetings, interviews the executive team and the top of the governance in an organisation. So that may be the board in a housing association, or the cabinet, or the scrutiny panel in the council. So over 80% C grades were published at the end of a programmed inspection. And the remaining close to 20% come from something that the regulator terms responsive engagement, which is largely, but not entirely, following from self-referrals by social housing landlords who have become aware of a weakness in their own compliance with regulatory standards. And there are a few that come about as a result either of whistleblowing or of the regulator following up on adverse press coverage. But largely it's self-referral by the landlords themselves. Of those 119 grades, the pie on the left-hand side shows the split between the grades C1 to C4. And we have nearly a quarter of those grades are a C1, so that's the top grade. The regulator is at pains to underline that a C1 is not a gold medal. It is saying that that landlord meets the regulatory requirements. but nevertheless, nearly a quarter, I think, is higher than we would have anticipated before the grades began to be published. The regulator itself had made several statements to the effect that it was expecting very few C1s in this first round of programmed inspections. So for there to be a quarter is perhaps at the upper end of our expectations. Nearly a half are C2s, and a C2 is a compliant grade. It says there is room for improvement, but that the standards are met. And C3 and C4 are where those standards are not met. And we have 2 landlords graded as C4 to date. And those are the London Borough of Newham and Castle Point in Essex. They're both local authorities. So that's the distribution when we look at the whole of the sample. Then we start to cut it in lots of different ways and to see what we can tell from taking a closer look at those grades. So the first chart shows a very stark story about the difference in the distribution of C1 to C4 between local authority landlords and housing association landlords. And notably, nearly 60% of local authority grades received to date are C3s, which means that the regulatory standards for consumer standards have not been met. Whereas the equivalent figure for C3s in housing associations is just 6%. And the corollary of that is that housing associations have a far higher proportion of C1s at nearly 40% and of C2s at 55%. There are no C4 housing associations so far. So the first pattern that we see when we cut that data is that housing associations on the whole are receiving higher grades against the consumer standards than local authority landlords. There are some exceptions. So there are 4 local authorities that are C1, and that's the 7% green at the bottom of the middle bar here. Those 4 are the City of Westminster, Barnsley Metropolitan Borough Council, West Lancashire Borough Council, and the London Borough of Enfield. So 2 London local authorities in that green 7% slice. And there are 4 housing associations that are C3. So that's the 6% slice at the top of the rightmost bar. And those 4 are Notting Hill Genesis, Octavia, which has merged now to become part of Abbury, Willow Tree, which is a small association in the southwest, and Anchor Hanover, which is a large retirement older persons housing association. I think I've already mentioned the 2 local authorities that are the 4% red at the top of the middle bar, the London Borough of Newham and Castle Point in Essex. There are no housing association C4s to date. So moving to look at a different pattern. This is the first of our box whisker charts, and just to highlight how they work, each of these horizontal bars shows the distribution of housing of landlords, so both housing associations and local authorities, by the size of the landlord, with the smallest to the far left and the largest to the far right. Those are on those blue horizontal lines. The coloured box rectangle in the middle is the interquartile range, so where 50% of those landlords sit if you line them up from the smallest to the largest, where the middle 50% sit. That's the interquartile range, and the horizontal black line in the middle of those rectangles is where the median is. So that's the landlord that is halfway along the ranking of all of those 119 C grades by size of landlord. So we're going to see some more box whisker, and that's basically how they work. And I find them to be a very quick way of looking at patterns in the distribution of, in this case, the C grades. We haven't included C4 here. There are only 2. They are and they are local authorities. So there's not much to be learned in terms of patterns that we can extrapolate from. What this chart is telling me is that in fact there's not that much of a relationship with size. So I think part of our priors might have been that larger landlords would be because they have stock distributed over a wider area, or because it's just sometimes difficult to see the individual event or narrative behind a very large number of average data. But that's not the case, actually. The median, so the horizontal black line in the middle of the rectangles, is not that different depending on the size of landlord. So the range of most landlords in C1, C2, and C3 is not that different. C3 has a higher upper quartile, but a lower maximum. And that's because the C3s, as we've seen before, are dominated by local authorities, which local authorities with retained stock tend to be larger than the full range of housing associations. So one might have expected there to be a strong gradient whereby the C3s would be quite obviously larger than the C1s, and that's not the case at all. As I say, there is some difference, but not as much difference as one might have expected. So this slide shows another strong pattern, like the Housing Association Local Authority split pattern, and unlike the size pattern. And this shows associations geographical distribution. So the second bar from the left is those associations which have more than 50% of their stock in London, and the second bar from the right is those associations and local authorities that have more than 50% of their stock in the north. And you can see a strong gradient between from London to the north that's consistent. It goes up in steps. To the extent that we have 55% of London landlords, so that's housing associations and local authorities, meet the regulatory standards compared with 89% of landlords in the north. So a big difference. I guess that regional pattern is not entirely a surprise because it's been evident in the Housing Ombudsman data for a while. So the Housing Ombudsman publishes landlord data once a year. It publishes a data set with the data on the numbers of complaints and the findings by landlord. We calculate our own metric on that data, which is the number of maladministration findings per 10,000 homes. And we have on our website some of the results of that analysis. And anyway, that has shown for 2 or 3 years now that London associations have a higher proportion of maladministration findings compared to relative to their stock size. So I think it's a consistent story. It's not a surprise, but it definitely merits some further investigation. And I think this chart illustrates possibly one of the drivers for that result, namely that London associations have lower C grades. And that's the proportion of landlord stock that is houses and bungalows versus the proportion of that stock which is flats. And you can see there's not a whole lot of difference between C1 and C2. The median size is practically the same. The distribution is, the interquartile range is practically the same. But there is a big difference with the C3s. You'll note there's a star against the C3s because this data is only housing association. I have been unable to find this data for local authorities. That box represents only 4 landlords, the 4 that we mentioned before that are C3. Nevertheless, the difference is so striking that I'm confident that it'll hold. Well, I'm confident that it stands a good chance of holding as the sample size increases. And we can see that landlords that have a less than 35, 37% of their stock as houses or bungalows are more likely to be a C3. They're more likely to be represented in the C3 landlords. And that's very probably part of the driving force behind the London landlords having on average a lower C grade than the others. Then we wanted to look at some of the relationship between those C grades and the overall satisfaction metrics, which have been part of the new consumer regulation regime. And this shows the relationship between the C grade received by the landlord and that landlord's overall residents' overall satisfaction with the service that they receive. So this is the overarching tenant satisfaction metric. And we can see there is a relationship. The vertical lines move from right to left as you go from C1 to C3. So there is some relationship between overall satisfaction and the C grade received, which you would have expected for two reasons. One, because the regulator looks at the tenant satisfaction metrics when it considers what grade to attribute to a landlord, but also because those things are all the things that a regulator considers in giving a C grade, including the condition of the homes, the landlord's handling of complaints, the repairs service, etc., are taken into account when they award a C grade, and those same factors would feed into residents' satisfaction with the service they're receiving. So no surprises. It would have been a surprise if we'd seen a reverse relationship, but also quite a lot of overlap. So it's not like, oh, you're a C3, your satisfaction is 70%, you must be a C1. Not at all. There's no direct relationship, but we can see there is a relationship. If I were to show this slide for the TSM, which is satisfaction with the repair service, it's almost identical, which again is not a surprise because we know and have known for decades that the key driver of overall satisfaction is satisfaction with the repair service. So that continues to be the case, and this analysis would support that. So some relationship with overall satisfaction, and then this shows the relationship with satisfaction with complaints handling. So again, the horizontal bars move from right to left as you go green, blue and yellow. And so the median, the median satisfaction with complaints handling for a C3 is lower than for a C1. So again, a relationship, not a surprise, both because the TSM will be looked at by the regulator, but also because it will consider the whole, the wider complaints issues when it awards a C grade. A different kind of a chart now. We, as you can possibly tell, we track the C grades. They're published mostly, but not entirely, once a month at the end of the month. And we both analyse the grades themselves and we read the regulatory judgments that are associated with each one of those grades. The regulatory judgments are publicly available on the same day as the grade is published. They are 3 or 4 pages. They are very interesting reading. I would urge everyone to ensure that their organisation keeps an eye on them, because there's a lot of learning to be had, particularly at this early stage of all of us getting used to this new regulatory regime. And the regulator uses some quite standard language in those regulatory judgments. And we have taken those regulatory judgments and just making a note of the reasons behind each C grade that isn't a C1. So that's 92 grades that span the C2, and C3, largely C2 and C3 with a tiddly bit of C4s. And we note how often these different reasons occur in the regulatory judgments. As with the G and V grades that housing associations have been receiving since 2015, there is never one reason that contributes to the grade. Sometimes it's 3 or 4, sometimes it's 6 or 8. So, but it's not one thing alone. But I think there's a lot of learning from this chart and from the reasons that are driving associations to receive lower than the top grade. And the first 3 are very dominant, and the first one is the condition of the homes. So this is all these 3 actually relate to the safety and quality standard. And 54 of the 92 landlords to receive less than a C1 mention stock condition data explicitly. And this can be the coverage of the stock condition data, its recency, so when was the last survey undertaken, the proportion of those surveys that are done by somebody physically crossing the threshold, and then what happens with that data. So, for example, does it drive the analysis of the amount of resource that needs to be invested in those homes to bring them up to an appropriate quality? So a huge number of those non-C1 grades see stock condition as part of the reasoning. Repairs and maintenance service, we can see when you read the judgments, is around both that tenant satisfaction with the repair service, but also things like meeting the landlord's own targets for repair times. Sometimes, the time the number of visits needed to fix an issue. So again, about the quality of the homes, and health and safety compliance, that third blue bar down, is entirely, I'm pretty sure it's entirely about building health and safety compliance. So this is both landlords that don't have enough data to know what their performance on the Big 6 or the Big 8 key building safety issues is, or they don't have assurance that that data is being measured correctly, or that they aren't addressing the gaps that performance information is telling them. So the top three huge dominant reasons for driving the C grades are around the quality of the homes that the residents are living in. Then we come across one which is called performance oversight. It's a general term, but it means the degree to which the board or the cabinet or the councillors have seen evidence that landlord complies with the consumer standards. So a landlord may or may not comply with the safety and quality standard, but how has the board or the cabinet or the councillors received assurance? What evidence do they have of compliance? So that's an important factor in those non-C1 grades. And then we have two that are both, or three that are around four. The next four are around the transparency, influence and accountability standard. And so those are around the ability of tenants to influence the service that they're receiving. And in particular, that landlords can demonstrate not just that their residents have lots of opportunity to influence the service, but that influence results in changed outcomes. So you might consult on the letter that goes out about the rent increases, but did you change anything because of the responses that you received when discussing that? And did that increase people's satisfaction with the landlord, or reduce the number of complaints about rent increases? So that's that. Equitable outcomes is how is the board or councillors or cabinet assured that the landlord is delivering fair outcomes, equitable outcomes to all of its residents. And that's about the degree to which you can demonstrate that you've analysed your repairs data, your complaints data, your satisfaction metrics by the protected characteristics. So you can be sure that vulnerable residents who need extra assistance, or people of different ages or in different ethnicities, receive similar outcomes from the service that you're delivering. And complaint handling speaks for itself. It's not just that the regulator looks at the ombudsman data, but also it looks at your internal, how you report on your internal complaints processes to your board or cabinet. So the top three are about safety and quality standard, and then 4, 5, 6 and 7 are about the transparency, influence and accountability standard, with the one in the middle there being about how the board or cabinet or councillors are cited on that information. And then onto our last slide, we've looked at factors that impact on the boundaries. So we know that in our in-depth assessments and now in inspections, the team that come to see you will decide a draft grade. So they will have an idea in their head about what grade they think they want to give you. And then they go back and they defend that to a kind of star chamber of the regulator. And they say, we think this landlord is a C2, and these are the reasons why. And then there's quite a bit of debate for those that are close to the boundaries. So not for those that are a clear C1 or a clear C3, but the regulator, both the team that visit you and the people that look to confirm the grades, will agonise a bit about, is it a C1 or is it C2 when it's near the boundary, or is it a C2 or is it a C3, again, when it's near the boundary. And what we can tell from the language that's used in those regulatory judgments for the 119 grades, C grades to date, or at least the 92 that are not C1s, is some very strong themes that come through in those decisions. And the most important of all is an assessment of the board's self-awareness. So for board, read councillors or cabinet or whatever the top level of governance of housing matters is. So we can see that people with a high self-awareness and understanding of the gaps in their own performance against the regulatory standards, where that ownership of that they have an improvement plan to fill those gaps, and the ownership is clear and rests with the board, and that there's monitoring of progress against that improvement plan. So an improvement plan that is smart, that has ownership of actions and timescales and monitoring. And then a willingness to take difficult decisions to steer back to course. So that is, you can see some indications of a shift in resources to, for example, putting more resources into the safety and quality of the homes, which will mean fewer resources, for example, into developing new homes, but a willingness to take decisions to ensure compliance with the regulatory standards and evidence of compliance with the regulatory standards. So we're pretty confident that those are some of the reasons that would influence a decision to go one or other way at a boundary of a grade. And we also observe that the C grade can have an impact on the G grade. So local authorities do not receive a governance grade or a viability grade for that matter, because the Regulator of Social Housing's remit does not extend to local authorities in those areas. So when we say the C grade can impact on the G grade, the governance grade, we're necessarily talking about just housing associations. But of the 40 housing associations that have a C2 or a C3, so that's there are no C4s in the housing associations at the moment, 25% of those saw their G grade downgraded when the C2 or the C3 was awarded at the same time. And so, and if you just look at the C2, so if we remove the 4 C3s from that, then 22% have received a governance downgrade at the same time. When you look at the G15, so that's the larger London associations, there are 4 grades for the G15 to date. They're all C2 or C3, and 2 of them were accompanied by a G downgrade and 2 of them weren't. So 50% of a C grade less than C1 has translated into a downgrade of the governance assessment by the regulator. So that's the last of the slides. I just wanted to say that we have a lot of further resources on our website around consumer regulation and inspection. We have a lot of articles and webinars and future webinars and podcasts. So a lot more information that we share with social housing landlords. So please do take a look in that area and check up on what we're doing in that space. I hope that's been useful and interesting, and thank you for taking a look. Thank you very much. Goodbye.